Thank you. Terrific video. I am Mark Terrell, the very proud president of the Associated Jewish Community Federation of Baltimore. And as I look around this room, I see many different leaders from many different organizations from across the community spectrum, across the denominations with varied backgrounds coming together at this unique opportunity to have a biennial conversation about things that we care about critical issues facing our community as a collective, as a community. That's unique when we come together in hopes of all rowing in the same direction. And I think, Joel, you captured that beautifully in that video. This afternoon, I have the honor of introducing our keynote speaker, who, given his immense responsibilities, has to decline speaking opportunities and engagements more than he accepts. We're very, very fortunate to have him. An abridged version of his bio is in your booklet, but an even briefer version I would like to share with you about Jonathan Greenblatt, who has been described as a serial social entrepreneur. Jonathan is the special assistant to the President of the United States and director of the Office of Social Innovation and Civic Participation in the Domestic Policy Council. In this role, he has incredible opportunities to shape agenda and to leverage human and financial capital to elevate communities. His portfolio includes such things as national service, civic engagement, impact investing, and social enterprise. Among many, many accomplishments, Jonathan also co-founded Ethos Brands, the business that launched Ethos Water, the premium bottled water that helps children from around the world get clean water. Jonathan also founded All for Good, the open source platform developed to enable more Americans to participate in volunteer opportunities. So obviously, Jonathan has a vast and immense, whether it's in the business sector or in the social justice sector of lifting up communities. And another important note is that Jonathan's wife, Marjan, is accomplished in her own right and is currently the chief operating officer of the Israel Campus Coalition. So when you get this family together, this is quite the power couple in terms of community and advancing change. Jonathan and Marjan are relatively new Marylanders and live with their 3 children in the suburbs of DC and very active in their communities, and I'm thrilled that Jonathan is here. Welcome, and help me welcoming Jonathan Greenblatt.
Thank you. So what a nice introduction that is. It's really cool that you mentioned my wife, so she'll get a big kick out of that. So let me thank Mark and certainly Rafi and Liz for putting on what seems to be a really neat event. And so for me, it's a privilege to have the chance to come up here. And to be introduced as a Marylander is really quite special, since we've lived on the West Coast for the last 13 years. So that's a change and a nice one, I'd say. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about the work that I'm doing at the White House, where I lead something called the Office of Social Innovation. Have any of you heard of the Office of Social Innovation? Rafi doesn't count. Mark doesn't count. Okay, there's a couple people. That's good. Well, so what I'll do is talk a little about what we're working on. But first, what I thought maybe I could do is give a little bit of background about me, sort of how I ended up here. And sort of, to be honest, I do a lot of speaking, and I have the opportunity to meet all kinds of people in this job. But for me, there is no place where I'm more comfortable than here. So I'm extremely comfortable in environments like this, because it's really my Jewish faith and sort of heritage which inspires my work and which sort of grounds it every single day. So it's easy for me to do this. And it's much nicer to be outside of Washington dealing with budgets and all kinds of other stuff. So I'm going to be pointing to you in the back. If you could cue up the next slide. So again, so this is a picture from the 30s of my grandfather. Actually, can you hit it again? And you can see him there on the right. And you can see up top his name. So he was a barber in a town called Magdeburg, Germany, which is in the eastern part of the country. And my grandfather was a survivor, and so he made it out. But the rest, all of his family did not. And, you know, my parents were first generation. But I will say that for us, like our Jewish experience is how we ended up in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where I was sort of born and raised in that area. And it was always a big part of our life. Next slide. And for my grandfather, who came here with nothing, He was someone who always had this idea, this belief, based on his own experience, that as hard as it was, and it was hard. I mean, to describe the Holocaust as hard is a gross understatement. But he had this remarkable sense of spirit, that things could get better, and if you willed it, it could be. And so his own life told him that even in the face of tragedy, you could change the world. And next slide. And so when I was young, he had me and my brothers and my family marching out in Bridgeport, Connecticut in support of the Soviet Jews, because we had this idea. And who from here emigrated from the Soviet Union? I bet you there's some. Well, there's one. There's one. You know, I mean, it's really amazing to me when I speak to Jewish audiences, because there we were holding placards, and that's not us, by the way, but holding placards and marching down like Main Street and Park Avenue, and sure enough, it happened, right? Now, there's a range of different reasons why it happened, but the fact of the matter is, for me at a very young age, it gave me the sense that if you want, you could will anything. And that our Jewish experience tells us that it isn't because we have all the money or all the resources or because of our quarterly meetings. It's off the record. It's because of the fact that we have this indomitable spirit. Next slide. And so that's what led me, when I graduated college 20 years ago, to go decide to volunteer for this governor from Arkansas. So I started volunteering while I was at Tufts University, and then when I graduated, I went and moved down to Little Rock and worked full-time for the governor. And eventually, why? Not because I thought he was going to win, truthfully. I didn't when I got involved, but I wanted to change the world. And I had seen before in my life that I could. And that inspired me to do this, which was a big step forward. My parents weren't political. No one in our family was. I was the first to graduate from college. So they thought it was kind of a crazy idea for their young son graduating from college to go move down to Little Rock, Arkansas, to work basically as an unpaid volunteer for this guy they didn't even think was going to win, but I wanted to change the world. And so it's why I joined his campaign, and that put me on a path that's really set the course of my life. Next slide. And it's how I ended up working for him. And so I think for me, it was really my Jewish experience which showed me that you can make great change. In the face of the insurmountable, that we could still persevere and push forward. And whatever your politics are, in my mind, it doesn't really matter. I think we all share this genetic code, this DNA, that tells us that we can be bigger, and we can do more, and we can change the world. Next slide. So, you know, it's interesting because working for this guy who spent most of his life really working in communities, and we were literally in a meeting on Friday, and he was talking about this with a group of young people. His own life experience tells him that you can change the world, and it doesn't happen, although he may now be on the biggest stage of all. What he is very comfortable with is talking to people one-on-one and thinking about how do we organize this block and bringing people together from churches and community centers and different political spheres and business and nonprofit, and finding common ground and making new things happen. And in that way, next slide, in some ways he represents this movement that we see all over the country of social entrepreneurs. Anyone recognize anyone in this? Ben and Jerry, okay. The ice cream guys, top right. How about that guy in the bottom right? Pardon? Honest Tea, Seth Goldman, another Marylander, down in Bethesda. Anyone recognize the guy on the bottom left? So that is a guy named Gary Hirschberg who runs a little business called Stonyfield Farms. Top left, that's a guy named Adelaide Wertman who ran an extraordinary nonprofit employing indigent people on the West Coast called Chrysalis, doing amazing work. So these are all what I would say our new form of community organizer. These are all social entrepreneurs. And they also have something else in common, which I'm guessing you can figure out. But there's a set of traits that they share. Go. So number one, I think we find that all these kinds of social entrepreneurs are change agents. They are people who throughout their life have done something different. They have this epiphany, often have this moment where they look and they think, I want to do something different in my life. I want to move off the path that I'm on and create bigger change. They take direct action. Social entrepreneurs are about doing something. It's not about talking about it. It's not about lobbying about it, although that matters. It's not about writing about it, although that has its place. But the social entrepreneur, he actually puts his hands on it, or she puts her hands on it and moves it forward. And it's about fixing a broken situation. It's about creating a new equilibrium. It's about attacking issues based on this notion of social justice. And it's about having an impact, and an impact that you can measure. Not just about talking about change, but doing it in a measurable way. And ultimately, what makes a social entrepreneur so different than typical folks in, say, the nonprofit field, different than most business people because they're about not just making profits, but making impact, and different than often folks in the nonprofit field, it's about using the market for good. And sort of these are some of the traits we find in social entrepreneurs all over the country. I'll tell you my quick story about how one might call me a social entrepreneur based on my experience in co-founding this company, Ethos Water, this brand of bottled water today that's in thousands of Starbucks all over the country and generating millions of dollars to bring clean water for children. But it started with this issue of water. So I was pretty surprised to learn, back at the 2001 about the world water crisis. Still today, nearly 1 billion people lack clean drinking water. A little more than 2.5 billion lack adequate sanitation. That means no place to brush their teeth, no place to wash their hands, often don't even have a sense of the relationship between hygiene and health. And so that results in children dying nearly every 14 seconds. It's the leading cause of death among children on the planet. A condition like malaria, which is enabled by, unfortunately, mosquitoes bearing this parasite, it's a huge problem, and it's the still stayed sickly water, which is the biggest source of its spreading. And oftentimes in sub-Saharan Africa, women will travel by foot on average of 6 miles a day to get clean water for their children, not clean water. So you can see they're often, they're not, they're not wearing their Tom shoes or their Tevis or whatever, their Uggs. They're in bare feet in difficult conditions, usually often with a child, bearing the water and things like that. And when they get to the water source, if there's water, they scoop it up, and it's pretty heavy when they're carrying it back. And then they're serving it to their kids, and it's not clean in the first place, so it just perpetuates the cycle of disease. Next slide. So at the same time, what do you think it would cost to deliver clean water? A lifetime access of clean water to a person in need? Well, according to WaterAid, a pretty credible British NGO, it's about $25 a day. This is a problem we can solve. Just down the road in Maryland, they cracked the genome, right, a few years ago. And just a couple weeks ago, the president announced the new grand challenge to map the human brain. Potable drinking water, we figured this one out 100 years ago. The Romans figured it out even earlier than that. We can do this. It can be done in our time, in our lifetime, if we will it. Next slide. What's interesting is that what we learned in starting Ethos was while the problem is so endemic around the world, here in the United States, the bottled water industry at the time we started the business was $15 billion. It's probably bigger today. And yet, clearly this is not exactly the most environmental friendly industry. Most of those bottled waters don't even land in the recycling stream. They land sort of outside of it. It's a big problem, and let alone the idea of taking your water from the French Alps and bringing it here and thinking that's better than what you can get out of your tap. So the idea behind Ethos was simple. It was water for water. I drink this water, someone gets clean water. So we started the business with the dream of changing the way people think about water. And we had two simple ideas behind that. The first one was that we would donate up to 50% of our after-tax profits to fund clean water programs around the world. It was a big number. And my parents, again, who always thought I was a little crazy after that Clinton thing, the idea of starting a business to give away half the profits, my dad just sort of struggled with that a little bit. But we felt it was a big commitment, and the cause required it. The next slide. And we also thought that we would use our marketing to educate people, not talk about how good our water tasted or what a fancy place it came from, but talk about the good it would create in the world. So we had this idea, and next slide, and sort of it took off from there. And then we had all kinds of funny moments. This is a picture after we launched at Whole Foods on the West Coast. This is sort of a funny story. So we had this water. This was a setup we did in Redondo Beach, California, and I remember getting a call at our global command center for Ethos Water, which was my house. At the time, we didn't have very many employees, far less than at this table here in front of me. How many of you? There's 6 of you? Like 1/6 of the number. And I got a call on our very complex, we had a very complex phone system. The phone would ring, and I would say, Ethos Water, how may I direct your call? And I would say, the marketing, And so we got a call one morning, and one of those calls, and I answered. And I said, how can I help you? And they said, this is the Whole Foods. They were in Thousand Oaks or someplace, and they wanted the Ethos barrel for their store. So I sort of went along with it, and I said, I'll have someone from the marketing department get right back to you, and I hung up the phone. I didn't even know what I really didn't know what he meant. But within an hour, I got a second phone call from another Whole Foods requesting the barrel. I don't know what you're talking about, but I said, well, this is Jonathan. I'm one of the two founders, and to clarify for you, we actually don't have any barrels. And this person said, oh, no, I know you do. I've seen it. I was like, well, what are you talking about? And he said, well, in Redondo Beach, they're using this barrel. And so I called Redondo Beach and said, what are you doing? So it turns out, you see that one on the left? That the staff had gotten so excited about the brand and the concept, they took an old 7-Up barrel, and they went to our website, and the sign maker in the back of the Whole Foods created that, there's some poor 7-Up guy still got knocked down for losing a barrel, and they built that whole thing. And then at another store, this was actually from Beverly Hills, they built this big, oh no, this one was Fairfax, they built this big end cap. I don't know if anyone here from the grocery business or the food business, you might know, it costs a lot of money to do something like that. They just did it for us. But go to the next slide. This was the most amazing thing. So in Beverly Hills, they did this. So they took our 12-bottle boxes, they emptied them out, put all the product on display, and the manager in the store, or the grocery manager in the store, wired those boxes together with his daughter over a weekend in their backyard and made that. See what it spells? That's when we knew we were onto something. I mean, this was really a really pivotal moment for us, because when we had created something that the guy who managing the grocery section of this store could feel some ownership in, some investment in, a cause that he could believe in, to us, that's, in many ways, that's what social entrepreneurship is all about. Next slide. So then we got a call from the little coffee company up in Seattle, and eventually, when they reached out, they wanted to buy the company, and we agreed, because we were able to create the kind of conditions that we thought would help us achieve our goal, which was change the way people think about water. They agreed to donate at least $0.05 a bottle, which was far more than we were doing at the time. And they also agreed to do a $10 million commitment right up front, which was a huge commitment right off the bat, no matter what happened. So we were able to scale up our commitment dramatically, then to use those 7,000 plus stores as marketing platforms to reach the 10 million consumers who walk through Starbucks every single week. It's actually like 40 million today. So it's a pretty big number. So Ethos worked out, not because we wanted to necessarily maximize, because we were pursuing a path of pure profit maximization, but instead because we realized we could strengthen community through a more expansive way of thinking about what's the role of business. And that's kind of a good setup, next slide, for what I'm doing now in the innovation agenda that we're trying to build, for not just for one company, but for the country, and the work that the president has tasked me to do. So for us, it's really about one idea, which is how can we create an enabling environment to support innovation at scale. For us, we think social innovation is about finding new ways to solve old problems. So when my mom says to me, how do I explain what you do to my friends? I say, Mom, this is what I'm doing. I'm trying to find new ways to solve old problems. And I'm trying to do it by bringing together nonprofits and business and government. And I'm trying to do it through two main levers. Next slide. So, of course, we work for the president and we do legislation and we make policy. But next slide, hit again. But we have, again, so we have two main things we're trying to work from: human capital and financial capital. That's what we're doing. So a social innovation agenda that we've laid out is focused on, can we accelerate economic recovery? Can we jumpstart job creation by doing a better job of harnessing our people and getting more resources to those who need it? Next. And so when I talk about people, I'm talking about models like national service. Are there any AmeriCorps people in the room? Raise your hands. So where did you tell us? Liz, you were AmeriCorps?
Yep.
Where did you serve?
I served in California. I was a domestic.
Yeah.
I was in California. I worked in a prison all Mount Felon, ages 11 to 25.
Wow.
Volunteer for.
That's amazing. Amazing.
My parents were thrilled when I landed 22 to this prison setting.
I'm sure they were. What about you? What's your name and?
I served in Baltimore City through the VISTA program.
It's great.
Engaging faith communities in violence prevention and education advocacy for Baltimore City.
That's super neat. So VISTA is Volunteers in Service to America. It was a program set up by President Kennedy and Sarge Shriver in 1961 to be the domestic equivalent to the Peace Corps. And over here?
My name is Megan Goldsmith. I was an AmeriCorps Public Ally here in Baltimore, Maryland, working at the Jewish Volunteer Connection.
How wonderful. So Public Allies is an amazing program that promotes leaders from within their own communities. I'm glad to hear that, Megan. Anybody else over here? That's fantastic. And over here? So TFA is one of the most remarkable programs in the country. How many of you have heard Teach for America? Raise your hand. How many of you Teach for America was AmeriCorps? You didn't even raise your hand. Oh, okay, there you go. So, I mean, it's amazing. TFA, Public Allies, Habitat for Humanity, City Year, Youth Build, even a lot of Meals on Wheels. These are AmeriCorps programs where young people commit to work in their community, whether it's helping offenders or working to do intergroup relations or lifting up sort of impoverished communities. So it's great to hear that all of you are AmeriCorps folks. So I work a lot on how do we expand AmeriCorps. I'll give you a statistic. Last year, nearly 750,000 Americans applied for AmeriCorps positions. 750,000. How many full-time AmeriCorps positions are there? 32,000. So there's a lot of demand out there as people want to give back. Next slide. So we also do a lot to work on promoting volunteerism. And there's an amazing surge of volunteerism in this country today. We just hit an all-time high of nearly 65 million Americans who actively volunteer. 65 million Americans. There are only 300 million plus Americans, right? And if you admit that some are maybe infirm or some are too young, this is an amazing statistic. Nearly a third of all adult Americans are volunteering. 30 to 25%. How many of you know Repair the World? Anyone? Can someone explain what someone who hasn't raised their hand to you? What does it do? Can you tell us?
Repair the World is a national organization focused on developing an agenda around service, Jewish service, and Jewish service.
That's brilliant. That's exactly right. So I couldn't have said it better myself. Are you on the board or something like that?
I'm the executive director of Jewish Volunteer.
Oh, there you go. There's always a ringer. I shouldn't have done. We should have done that a little better. Yeah, I mean, so it's a remarkable organization, and so what's happening in the Jewish community is happening in ethnic and faith-based communities all over the country, and it's really a wonderful thing. And so we actually just launched last week in the budget that we proposed a new thing, a $10 million volunteer generation fund that we named after George H.W. Bush, the 41st president. Volunteerism is one of those remarkable areas where we have been bipartisan for decades. There is nothing political about young people doing Teach for America or working in their communities to make it better. And don't let anybody tell you that there should be, because there shouldn't be. And so President Obama was on the phone with HW last week, letting him know, and we spoke to the Bush family. And we did this because the heritage they created with Points of Light have really helped to demonstrate that it's not about politics, it's just about how do you uplift communities. And so civic participation, actually, the public allies in the room will recognize that little logo on Ernesto. And behind Ernesto, that woman in white's a TFA member in Southeast DC. And that gentleman over there is with the National Collegiate Advisory Corps. And this woman over here is with, I think she might be in Avista. So we had this really, just the other day. The president really believes that all Americans of all ages, of all capabilities, have ways that they can contribute to their community. And we've got good data that shows us that communities with higher degree of civic health, higher degrees of volunteering, voting, have lower rates of unemployment. There's absolutely a positive correlation afoot in the fact that when we increase social capital, we increase our economic resilience. So next slide. So in addition to harnessing human capital, we're also very focused on facilitating financial capital. But this isn't investment dollars, again, to maximize profits. It's thinking instead about how can we drive resources to increase purpose and to help the American people. Next slide. So we're doing a bunch of different things. Innovation funds, taking the best ideas of venture capital and applying it into government. In the budget last week, for example, we announced, and we've got several funds that we've already created, like the Social Innovation Fund. Any of you heard of the Social Innovation Fund? So can you tell us what it is in the back? That's you, yeah. Stand up and tell us your name. Davina, that's great. So the Social Innovation Fund is a $50 million fund. It invests in intermediaries who then put the money to work in local high-impact nonprofits. To date, it's raised about $150 million, 3 years. We're going into our 4th year. But what's more interesting, to get the money, the organizations need to show they can raise matching dollars. So our 150 has catalyzed another 350 million plus. It's been deployed in hundreds of high-impact organizations across the country. Most importantly, how many of you would buy a stock? This may seem unrelated, but it's related. How many of you would buy a stock without looking at information about how that stock performed the day before? Would anybody just buy a stock like this? Probably not, right? If you're sports fans or you maybe bet on the NFL games, which you probably shouldn't do, would you do that without looking at the line? Look, every day we make decisions based on information. Unfortunately, that's not always the way we make policy in Washington. So this may come as a surprise. So we're trying to change that. And models like the Innovation Fund rest on this idea of evidence. We're encouraging intermediaries to invest in what works, where we have data to show that nonprofits that can make an impact, a measurable, quantifiable difference, are the ones that get the money. It's the same way we buy stocks. It's the same way we make decisions on a day-to-day basis. Next slide. So we're doing work to expand the use of program-related investments. These are financial instruments that foundations can use. So they're not always making direct grants to nonprofits, but did you know that foundations can also offer things like credit enhancements to nonprofits, loan guarantees, lines of credit, even equity investments in businesses pursuing charitable purpose? PRIs have been around for 40 years, but haven't been frequently used because foundations don't understand how to use them. Why does that matter? Well, we saw about $50 billion last year in philanthropic giving from foundations. $50 billion. Sounds like a lot of money, and it is, until you realize that the $50 billion represents about 7% of the total assets that foundations have in their corpus. So what's more interesting to us is how do we unlock the $650 billion and point that toward doing good in communities? PRIs come not from the grant money, but from the endowments and the way that foundations can get more leverage on their money and put it to good use. Next slide. And now we're making a big push around something called Pay for Success. Many of you might hear about it in the papers called social impact bonds. Has anyone heard of that before? Anyone heard of what the social impact bond is? I saw some brave soul in the back. Can you stand up and you tell us what it is? Another ringer. Can you tell us your name? That's great. Yeah. That's excellently, that's right. So Mayor Bloomberg did a social impact bond last year, focused on could we reduce recidivism or the rate of reoffense in New York City. He had a program that he knew worked, that did a great job, but City Hall money is diminishing. So he went to Goldman Sachs. He said, Goldman Sachs, give me $9.6 million to fund this program. And if it reduces the rate of reoffense by at least 10% in 4 years, I'll give you all your money back. So you front me the $9.6 million, and if it works, give you all of it back. But if it does better, if it reduces the rate of reoffense by 11%, 12, 15, 20, Goldman, you can earn up to 22% back on your money. So how in the world could the city of New York afford to do that? To give Goldman Sachs a return on, take like this loan from Goldman Sachs, if you will. Because the savings that the city will enjoy by keeping those kids out of prison more than allows them to give Goldman a rate of return. And we know alleviating homelessness, routing kids in on the right educational track, increasing the wages that people are paid through better workforce development, getting people off of the long-term, off the unemployment rolls, or reducing recidivism, or keeping kids healthy. We know that we know that it's an old adage that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And so we hope that by focusing on models like this, we can do that at scale. We propose $300 million in the budget to create a fund at the Treasury Department that will help cities and counties and states do this at scale. So there won't just be one single social impact bond in the city of New York, but I hope we'll have hundreds of them all over the country within a year's time. Again, allowing investors to get a return on their money and allowing communities to get the resources they need to fund what works. Next slide. And so lastly, what I would say is, can you hit it one more time? So for me, like a lot of this, like I said, this idea of how can we take social innovation to scale? How can we use human capital and financial capital to strengthen our communities? How can we change the world? It comes back for me to my own sort of Jewish heritage. And sort of learning about these things, Tikkun Olam, and doing it for me is the impetus. So many people, this is a very sort of famous picture. I'm sure you all recognize the man in the middle of the page. So when I've shown this picture before to young people, I said, "Do anyone know that man on the second one in on the right?" And Colonel Sanders, some people say. I'm guessing that someone in this audience might know who that is. Yeah, that's right. It's not Colonel Sanders. It's Abraham Joshua Heschel, the famous theologian. And he said every deed counts. Every word matters because everyone has the power to change the world. And so I'll leave you. Can you hit this one more time? I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much. Do we have time for Q&A? So I'm happy to answer questions if anybody has any. Pardon? Oh, there are mics. Great. So you can use the mic. You can just raise your hand. And if there are no questions, I would just slink away. Yes?
So how would a community like ours begin to engage in dabbling in scaling innovation and programs that will, in the end, we know, save us money, be innovative, but also improve our community?
That's a good question. So I mean, that's a really good question and not necessarily an easy one to answer. But I would look at both, again, what are your resources? The president believes our most valuable sort of renewable resource is the spirit of the American people. And I saw that video, and I know the heritage here, the Jewish community alone in Baltimore. You have it here in spades. So I would be thinking, number one, how can we harness our human capital more effectively? How can we get every citizen, every Jewish citizen of Baltimore engaged in urban renewal or the projects that you have that are important? And I would think broadly about how one can do that. So it could be, your big mitzvah day or whatever it is that the Federation runs, or it could be, with a swipe of your finger across a tablet or a tap of your finger on a phone. Are there other programs and ways to get people involved in doing good? Bringing people together, increasing social capital can lead to, I think, all kinds of positive change. And then in terms of facilitating financial capital, how many of you are involved in philanthropy? Raise your hand. Fair number. How many of you do what's known as impact investing? Good question. So most people don't know what the phrase impact investing means. You also knew who Heschel was, so you're probably another ringer. But can you explain what impact investing is to?
Well, the way we look at impact investing in my organization is that
Which is your name and your organization?
my name is Joel Simon, and I work at Sinai Hospital in Southern Arizona. The way we look at it, I don't have a loud enough now. The way we look at impact in investing is back to how you measure return on the dollar. That's the phrase we use to say. You do not simply measure the return on a dollar based upon, there are a number of ways to quantify it. Which goes quantifiable numbers and quality numbers.
That's great.
That's a little bit to do with healthcare.
A lot to do with healthcare. A lot to do with healthcare. So look, I think other ways you can be involved can be impact investing, putting your money to work not just through grants but through investments in businesses which are strengthening your community. And I think there's multiple ways that you can do that. But businesses who are measuring and reporting on the good that they generate, that's a pretty good place to start. I think for those of you who run foundations or involved in foundations, looking at PRIs, again, which are ways you can use foundation dollars, get tax credit for it, and give nonprofits the resources that they need to run their programs, not through grants, but through loans or through equity and through other models. Another thing that we're working very hard on is data. So again, in order to make good decisions in any context, you need data. The data about nonprofits has often not been something that folks could access. So we just put something in the budget again last week that is mandating that all nonprofits will file their 990 annual tax returns electronically in the coming years. All of them. That means many of you. Why is that important? Well, because we're also mandating that the IRS will publish that information in a timely manner and make it accessible to the public. Today, if you wanted to look at a 990, and you have the right to as a taxpayer, the IRS has an obligation to make that available to you. You can write a letter to the IRS. They'll open your letter. They'll go to their servers, and they'll save an electronic return on a CD-ROM and send it back in the mail to you. I'll say that one more time. So it's yeah, on an 8-track, Rafi asks. So it's not the best model. But again, if we hope to attract capital at scale into the nonprofit sector, we need better information about. Can you come up to the microphone? About what the nonprofits are actually doing, so we have better financial reporting. The same way, again, when you buy stocks, you do it based on the financial reporting of companies. So what can you do? Host a hackathon. Get a bunch of young people here in Baltimore to focus on open data and see what you can do with it. Because for us, it's not about releasing the data and us building some piece of software. We'll let the entrepreneurs, we'll let the innovators, we'll let the young people do that. We'll let the scholars at Johns Hopkins or the University of Maryland at Baltimore do the analysis. All we want to do is get the information out there, and then we'll let the innovators take and do great things with it. So that's another hands-on thing that you could do. A hackathon. Get a bunch of hackers together, buy them a couple cans of Red Bull, they'll be fine, and put them against a problem. Have them analyze a data set for you. If you go to data.gov, we've released a ton of data, energy, education, health.gov, to the gentleman in the back, is incredibly robust and has released all kinds of information from HHS. And not only do we have apps in the iTunes store, we have whole companies that have been created with this model, creating jobs and driving economic growth. So you could do that here. You could do that right here. Question over here.
Rabbi Daniel Berg from Beth Am Synagogue in the city of Baltimore. When it comes to the Jewish community, it seems that dollars have been flowing the other way or not at the same levels into the Jewish coffers to be distributed. So just in terms of risk and return on investment, I'm curious about how do you spur that entrepreneurial spirit, right? So, and I guess related to that is, what would have happened or what would happen if Goldman Sachs doesn't reach that amount and Mayor Bloomberg has to return the money? Where does the money come from then?
That's a good question. So there are multiple questions. So on the pay for success model, the reason, although some describe it as a social impact bond, we call it pay for success. Because the way that works is, for Goldman, there's risk involved. Because if the program doesn't reach the 10% rate of reduction, Goldman gets back that much, 0. So the city only pays if the program works. We only pay for success. So there's risk for Goldman in order for them to get the return. And where does the money come from? In that specific case, the city has to escrow the savings, basically, and then use the cash to pay back the investor, principal and interest, and a return if it works. But with respect to how do we do this in the Jewish community, Rabbi, because I think that's the first part of your question, I wasn't here for the earlier presentation, but I think the level of social entrepreneurship in the Jewish community is remarkable. It is so fertile, and there's so much remarkable, robust innovation. I find it really amazing. So whether it's the kind of for-profit entrepreneurs I put up there earlier on the screen, or people like the folks that Slingshot is funding all over the country, there's a renaissance taking place in our community. And I think we're at the sort of cutting edge in terms of faith-based communities across the country. And I think it's a blessed thing. Now, a valid question to ask is, well, how do we bring that to Baltimore?
And specifically back into, so I think just to nuance the question a little bit, I think the great challenge in the Jewish community is there's a lot of interest in leveraging that Jewish energy for either the sort of broader nonprofit sector or for the sort of outside of the typical
versus framework
Jewish community. The question is, how do you leverage that to bring it back into some of the more traditional institutions that many of the people in this room represent without their having to sort of lose
That's a good question.
the institutions that actually matter to them and actually matter in the work that they do?
So I can tell you right now that I don't know the answer to that. I think it's almost existential in a way. But so when we were out in Los Angeles, my wife was on the board of Federation. I was on the board of the Community Foundation, and we struggled with these issues, is how do you keep federation relevant to a younger generation that didn't seem as engaged with it? We think federations play a crucial role in cohering Jewish communities. They have for 100 years, as have shuls and synagogues. So I think the challenge is how do we, as a community, and how does the federation system and the established Jewish sort of infrastructure adapt and integrate the tools of this 21st century from techno. How many of you know what that yellow text is there? Raise your hand if you know. So for those of you who didn't raise your hands, so that's my Twitter handle. So that may seem Twitter. So many of you probably don't even know what that is. So that's a challenge. So I mean, I think that the community needs to, listen, the Jewish community for millennia has adapted and integrated perhaps better than any other in like the history of humanity. So I have no doubt that this too, shall pass and we will move through this. But I think it needs to be a challenge that we accept and with intention we tackle. So I don't have the answer, but I know it's an imperative. Yes, over here.
Hello, Jonah Geller from Capital Camps and Retreat Center. From what you know, what you've seen, or both, what other Jewish communities around the country are models of excellence, are leading this charge?
That's a good question. So I can speak to what I know, although I think there's a lot more out there. So what do I know? Well, I've seen the Jewish community in LA. There's an organization in LA called Jewish Jumpstart. It's a nonprofit simply focused on reinvention and social entrepreneurship within the organized Jewish community. And they actually have a physical space where they incubate other new, interesting Jewish nonprofits. It's pretty amazing. There's amazing things happening in the Bay Area. The San Francisco Bay Area is a fertile place for innovation of all sorts, and you see it in the Jewish community as well. I'm amazed at what's happening in New York. You can't like shake a stick without bumping into another really interesting Jewish venture. And shuls like what's it called, BJ? BJ there, or a car, and in Los Angeles, and others are doing really good stuff too. Heck, just down the road in Washington, we've been really impressed with 6th and I. Is that what it's called, 6th and I? The shul down there is pretty amazing. So look, I mean, I think there's lots to learn to look at these different communities. I wish I knew more and could better answer your question, but there are many models from which I think you can draw inspiration. Yes, over here. Can you remind me of your name, please?
Ashley from
Ashley.
Volunteer Connect.
Right.
So for somebody who has an idea, thinking about, has an entrepreneurial idea, what do you feel like are the supports that they need personally and communally in order to get started?
So actually, Ashley, that's a great question and a good thing to come back to Rafi's earlier question, which is, so what can we do? So back to Jonah, right? It's a question about, so what cities are doing something interesting? So in Los Angeles, they've created something called like the Jewish Venture Funding Network. They have a bunch of Jewish donors or supporters of Federation and the Community Foundation who actually review pitches from Jewish entrepreneurs for any organization they want to start in their community. You should have something like that here. You should have something like that here. Don't need a lot of money. The most important thing that an entrepreneur needs is typically mentorship and support. So I mean, one of the things that you could do is organize all the talent that you've got right here and make it easy for young Jewish entrepreneurs to find it. And then to get back to the rabbi's question, you'll be able to reinvent yourselves. You'll be able to embrace this change. So typically what entrepreneurs need and those people with ideas is a bit of mentorship and a bit of money. And if you can facilitate both and maybe offer ways to get volunteers engaged in their work, you could do all kinds of interesting stuff. How about take one last question? Yes, there's two actually. So I'll take yours, ma'am, and then yours in the back.
I'm Buffy Macon from the Meyerhoff Family Charitable Funds. I work with Rafi. What do you think about a mandatory year of service for all young people coming out of high school before they go to college?
So I can't tell you how much I believe in national service. I just think it is such a powerful thing. I think it's a powerful thing for those kids from well-heeled neighborhoods. I think it's a powerful opportunity for kids who are less economically advantaged. To do it on a mandatory basis, I'm not sure. I don't know that I would support that necessarily, and it's not our position as an administration. But I certainly see the tremendous benefit and value for those people who do it. They give back to their communities. They learn a lot along the way, and it helps them, I think, be better citizens going forward. So I believe in national service, as does the president. Mandatory, I don't know, but I wish more people would do it. And then there was a question in the back.
My name is Kathy Babb, and I wanted to ask, what have you done with the profits from the water company that you started? What successes have you had? And how do you define that as Jewish? How does it, I guess, translate that not just helping the world, but being Jewish?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, so what did I do with the profits? Well, I probably wouldn't talk exactly about that. But I can tell you what we did as a company with the profits, right? And so we invested in sustainable water and sanitation programs in sub-Saharan Africa, in India, in South Asia, and in Latin America. So like, for example, I remember visiting an orphanage in, it was in Kenya, in like an urban environment in Kenya. I can't remember the capital of Kenya off the top of my head. Nairobi. Where they had set up a cistern and they had set up a cistern and a filter system to collect rainwater because the kids in this orphanage didn't have clean drinking water. And then they built a series of latrines outside where those kids could actually go to the bathroom. I remember being in Ethiopia and seeing an entire similar setup they created in a very rural environment in the western part of the country. I've seen, communities in southern India, in Central America that have benefited from this work. It's typically about, number one, clean drinking water. So those are tapping low-lying aquifers with simple systems to access the water. Number two, hygiene. So that's typically involving things like latrines, basins, showers, things of that sort. And number three, hygiene education that puts it all together and helps people understand the connection between, washing your hands and health, which isn't something we may take for granted here, but is a challenge in places where there is no formal education system and this information isn't always shared. Some of my best memories of years of work and years of toil of working on ethos were visiting kids in these schools and going back and seeing how their lives had improved year over year. And so for me, the idea of committing to a cause and being a part of it and making a decision in the first place to start a business that would give away its profits, that to me was deeply, deeply, deeply informed by my Jewish values and my Jewish faith. Because I think I'm not just here for me, And I think for every world we save the world entire. So every single day, every single minute that I worked on ethos or the businesses that I've been involved with since then, or the decision to move my family across the country, come back to public service, has always been, I think, inspired by, the Jewish values, which sort of have guided me throughout my life. All right. Thanks very much, you guys.